As Granada falls, 3 ships sail into the unknown, carrying Spain toward its destiny. From the New World to the Pacific, from glory to decline, this is the epic saga of the Spanish Empire, and welcome to Twilight Tales. Chapter 1: The Origins and Birth of an Empire. Part 1: The Reconquista and the Fall of Granada. At the dawn of the year 1492, Europe stands on the brink of a transformation that no one can yet imagine. In the south of the Iberian Peninsula, in the sun-drenched plains of Andalusia bathed in golden light, the final act of a struggle that has lasted nearly 8 centuries is unfolding. The Reconquista, the white and ochre ramparts of Granada, the last Muslim capital of Al-Andalus, still stand proudly at the foot of the Sierra Nevada. But behind their walls lies a weakened kingdom, surrounded by forces that seem inexorable. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, have sworn to bring this chapter to a close. Their union, forged as much by love as by political strategy, has given rise to a new power in the peninsula. Now they advance hand in hand, cloaked in a destiny they believe to be sacred. Before them, Granada is but the final stronghold to be toppled to fulfill a millennial dream, a Christian, unified, and conquering Spain. In the mountain air, a scent of anticipation lingers. The pilgrims and soldiers accompanying the crusade murmur prayers at dusk, believing they hear in the whisper of the wind the voices of saints watching over the campaign. The flames of campfires illuminate the hills, and thousands of pit tents form a sea of white and red around the besieged city. The banners of Castile and Aragon snap in the icy breeze. It is an army, but it is also a procession. Everyone senses that history in these arid lands is being written with sword and faith. At the summit of the Alhambra, the palace with delicately carved walls, the last Nasrid Sultan, Boabdil, gazes at the enemy. His eyes wander over the hills where the Christian army spreads like a tide. The gardens around him still hum with the song of fountains, but in his heart a storm rages. Boabdil knows that Granada's fate no longer belongs to him. He is but the twilight guardian of a condemned world. Negotiations follow one another, threats and promises intertwine. His people, weary from famine and division, plead to yield before blood is spilled, but to yield is to betray the millennial legacy of the Andalusian emirs. To resist is to rush toward total ruin. In the Christian camps, chroniclers write with exaltation. They compare the endeavor to a new crusade, the last great battle of Christendom against Islam in the West. Knights from all the provinces of Spain, and even from Italy and Flanders, align themselves alongside the Catholic monarchs. The siege of Granada is not merely a military affair, it is a symbol. A victory here would open the gates to a new era, as if the completed Reconquista would unleash dormant forces, ready to project beyond the seas. The months drag on, marked by assaults, sorties, and negotiations. But gradually, the city weakens. Supplies dwindle, dissent undermines resistance. Finally, in January 1492, Boabdil accepts the inevitable. In a solemn scene, he hands over the keys of Granada to Isabella and Ferdinand. Chroniclers report that he shed bitter tears as he left the Alhambra, turning back one last time to gaze at his resplendent city, bathed in the almost unreal light of the setting sun. His tears, it is said, became famous as the sigh of the Moor. The triumphant entry of the Catholic monarchs into Granada is a striking spectacle. The bells ring out furiously. Religious processions fill the streets with chants and incense. Christian flags replace the narrated banners, and a cross is raised atop the Alhambra's tower. In the imagination of contemporaries, it is the ultimate victory, proof that God has chosen this royal union to fulfill a historic mission. But behind this glory, something greater is taking shape. With the Reconquista complete, what remains to conquer? Spain, now unified, discovers a new energy. Its knights, sailors, and navigators are no longer held back by internal wars. The Mediterranean routes seem narrow. Eyes now turn toward the Atlantic, toward those mysterious horizons that medieval legends filled with enchanted islands and distant kingdoms. That same winter, a stubborn man with fiery eyes and red hair stands at the court of the Catholic monarchs. His name is Christopher Columbus. For years, he has dreamed of reaching the Indies by crossing the unknown ocean. He has knocked on the doors of Portugal, England, and France, finding no one to listen. But in Spain, in this year of 1492, his project finds an unexpected echo. Isabella and Ferdinand, emboldened by their resounding victory, see in his proposal an opportunity to write a new page of glory. Thus, at the very moment when Granada falls and the last breath of Al-Andalus fades, an adventure is being prepared that will forever change the face of the world. While the streets of Granada still echo with the steps of Christian processions, ships are being outfitted in the port of Palos de la Frontera. 3 caravels stand ready, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The sailors murmur that their voyage will take them to the edge of the world, into darkness where sea monsters may lurk. But others see the promise of gold, spices, and boundless riches. It all seems almost fated, as if the end of one world, that of the Muslim Emirates of Spain, immediately opens the door to the birth of another. Granada, through its decline, becomes the threshold of a vaster empire, an even grander epic. In this month of January 1492, no one truly knows it, but Spain, now mistress of its destiny, is about to leap into the unknown. The adventure beginning here will no longer be confined to the peninsula. It will set the oceans ablaze. The Reconquista ends in the chants of processions and the sighs of the vanquished, but on the horizon, beyond the waves, deeper, vaster, more terrifying, and marvelous mysteries open up. It is the end of one story, but above all, it is the dawn of another, that of the Spanish Empire, the first global empire, born from the convergence of faith, ambition, and chance. Part 2. Isabella, Ferdinand, and the Union of the Crowns. The history of imperial Spain cannot be written without mentioning the 2 figures who were its architects, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Their marriage, celebrated in 1469 in the city of Valladolid, was not merely the union of 2 individuals, but the founding pact of a collective destiny. Together, they would forge a new monarchy, no longer just a juxtaposition of kingdoms, but the embryo of a power that would soon radiate across several continents. At the time, the Iberian Peninsula was still fragmented into multiple kingdoms: Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Portugal, and the Emirate of Granada. Each bore its own heritage, laws, and ambitions. But Castile, vast and rich, possessed the raw strength of agricultural lands and trade routes, while Aragon dominated the Mediterranean through its fleet and possessions in Italy. The union of the two crowns represented a formidable alchemy: terrestrial power and maritime might, internal wealth and openness to the world. Isabella, the young Queen of Castile, established herself from her accession through her iron will. She was not a figurehead sovereign, but a strategist, lucid, tenacious, and driven by ardent faith. Her gaze, chroniclers report, never wavered. She could be gentle and pious, but also relentless when the interests of the state demanded it. Ferdinand, King of Aragon, also had the makings of a great leader, a skilled politician, cunning diplomat, and shrewd military strategist. Together, they formed a couple, feared by their enemies and revered by their supporters. Their marriage was not universally accepted. Castilian nobles feared Aragon's influence over their affairs. Some worried that Isabella would lose her independence, but the queen yielded nothing. She ensured her own authority was enshrined in the marriage agreements, demanding that Ferdinand be not only her husband, but her partner. In official documents, the two reigned side by side: Isabel y Fernando, Rey y Reina de Castilla, de León, de Aragon, de Sicilia. This dual name was not a formality, but a tangible sign of shared power. From this alliance emerged an unprecedented political and military force. In Castile, Isabella restored order, broke the power of turbulent grandees, and imposed royal authority. She strengthened justice, reorganized the army, and developed the Santa Hermandad, a militia that maintained peace in the countryside. In Aragon, Ferdinand solidified ties with the Mediterranean, overseeing possessions in Naples and Sardinia, paving the way for broader ambitions. But beyond reforms and wars, their union carried a sacred dimension. Isabella and Ferdinand saw themselves as instruments of providence. Their mission, they believed, was to make the Catholic faith triumph and to build a model kingdom. In this, they relied on the Pope and an increasingly influential church. Religion became the cornerstone of their authority, the torch guiding their endeavors. This religious zeal would soon leave its mark on the major events of their reign. Religious unification was set as a priority: the Reconquista, the fight against Granada, but also the establishment of the Inquisition. In 1478, with the Pope's approval, Isabella and Ferdinand founded the Tribunal of the Holy Office, intended to maintain the purity of the faith. In their minds, Spain was to be a land unified not only politically, but also by belief. This choice would leave an indelible mark on history, for better or worse, as it brought cohesion, but also persecution. Yet, behind the religious austerity, the Spain of the Catholic monarchs also breathed a new energy, a breath of grandeur. Financial reforms restored order in the provinces, and the stability of a firm government renewed confidence among merchants, sailors, and artisans. Spain, freed from internal struggles, was ready to look beyond its borders. The ports of Seville and Palos saw an influx of men eager for adventure, ready to try their luck on the seas. The political vision of the Catholic monarchs already extended beyond the peninsula. By marrying their children to great European dynasties, Isabella and Ferdinand wove a network of alliances linking Spain to England, Portugal, and soon the Habsburgs. This matrimonial diplomacy, subtle and patient, would make their descendants heirs to a colossal European empire. But for the moment, at the end of the 15th century, the priority was to complete the unification of the peninsula. The fall of Granada was the direct result of their shared determination. Isabella accompanied the army, personally overseeing the troops' logistical needs. Ferdinand commanded on the battlefield, directing maneuvers and negotiating with lords. Their presence side by side reinforced the idea that they were not two sovereigns, but a single will. When Granada yielded and the cross was raised over the Alhambra, all of Europe understood that something new had been born. A new kingdom, no longer merely Castilian or Aragonese, but Spanish in its essence. The union of the crowns was not an immediate administrative fusion, but in the collective imagination, it was already forging a nation. And it was precisely this victory and newfound unity that opened the door to the transoceanic adventure. Without internal stability, without the combined power of Castile and Aragon, Christopher Columbus would never have found sovereigns capable of supporting his audacious project. But Isabella and Ferdinand, basking in their success, sensed that the time for great enterprises had come. Thus, through their marriage, faith, and determination, the Catholic monarchs laid the foundations of an empire. What began as a dynastic union would become the bedrock of a planetary adventure. Their name already resonated as that of founders. Their portraits, painted in monasteries and palaces, depicted them as new Constantines, sovereigns chosen to usher in an era of grandeur. With the Reconquista complete and the Union consolidated, all that remained was to cross the oceans. Spain, carried by the momentum of its sovereigns, was preparing to discover a new world. And this world would soon become the stage for its dreams, conquests, glories, and tragedies. Part 3. Columbus and the Discovery of the New World. The year 1492, already marked by the fall of Granada, would become one of the most memorable in all of human history. As Spain's bell still rang with the Christian victory, an audacious, almost insane project was taking shape in the small Andalusian port of Palos de la Frontera. There, 3 modest ships, the caravels Nina and Pinta, accompanied by the larger Santa Maria, were preparing to face the vastness of an unknown ocean. At their helm was a man with burning eyes, Christopher Columbus. Columbus was not Spanish, but Genoese. For years, he had haunted European courts with his obstinate dream to reach the Indies by sailing west. In his mind, the earth was round and smaller than imagined. He believed that beyond the Atlantic lay a direct passage to Cipango, the mythical Japan, and Cathay, the fabulous lands described by Marco Polo. He was called a visionary, but also a madman. Many mocked him, claiming the ocean was endless, infested with sea monsters and eternal darkness. Portugal, a land of navigators, had rejected his project. England and France dismissed him with disdain. But in Castile, at this precise moment when Spain had just unified, his boldness found a receptive ear. Isabella, more than Ferdinand, sensed the breath of providence in this enterprise. Was it not the destiny of her freshly unified kingdom to carry the cross and the banner beyond the seas? Was it not the time for new horizons after completing the Reconquista? Thus, on August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail. The docks of Palos were filled with curious onlookers, some admiring, others incredulous. The sailors, rough men, departed with fear. They murmured that the ocean would swallow them, that their ships would be lost in the abyss. But behind their fear shone the lure of riches, spices, gold, silks, all the wonders promised by the East. The crossing lasted weeks that seemed like centuries. Each day the horizon revealed only the infinity of waves, a liquid desert with neither landmark nor end. The winds carried the ships toward the unknown, but the men sank into fear. It is said that murmurs of mutiny grew. Some wanted to turn back, others accused Columbus of dooming them. But the navigator, inflexible, kept his eyes fixed on the west. His faith was as solid as the wood of his caravels. The nights were the most terrifying. Under the starry sky, the sailors thought they saw strange lights, monstrous shadows rising above the waves, legends of Atlantis, cursed islands and sea creatures with gaping jaws returned with every rustle of the wind. But amidst this anguish, Columbus repeated that God was guiding them, that the sea was a path, not a barrier. Then, after more than 2 months of navigation, when despair threatened to break everything, a cry rang out in the night of October 11th to 12, 1492, "Land! Land!" The lookout on the Pinta had spotted a dark shape on the horizon. The men, incredulous, rushed to the deck, and at dawn, under a still-veiled sky, they saw the outlines of a verdant island bathed in sunlight rise before them. It was like a biblical vision, a miraculous apparition after the oceanic darkness. Columbus set foot on this unknown shore, dressed in his finest clothes, the banner of Castile in one hand, a cross in the other. The sailors fell to their knees, thanking God. They believed they had reached the Indies, but in reality, they had set foot on a world that had never appeared on the maps of the Old World. The island was called Guanahani by its inhabitants. Columbus renamed it San Salvador. The first encounters were marked by curiosity and astonishment. The natives, naked, their bodies painted, approached without hostility. They offered fruits, colorful feathers, small gold objects. Columbus, in his journal, wrote that they were gentle and generous, that they could easily be converted to the Christian faith. But behind his words, another vision already emerged, that of a world offered a people to dominate, riches to exploit. Over the weeks, Columbus explored other islands, Cuba, which he took for Japan, and Hispaniola, where he founded the first European colony in the New World. The ships were loaded with samples, unknown plants, and a few natives brought back as witnesses. In the minds of the sailors, there was no doubt. They had found a land of wonders. When he returned to Spain, Columbus was welcomed as a hero. In Barcelona, he entered the court of the Catholic monarchs with an exotic procession. Brightly colored parrots, natives adorned with jewelry, chests of gold and spices. Isabella and Ferdinand, marveling, received him as an envoy of Providence. Soon all of Europe would speak of this discovery. No one yet understood the magnitude of the upheaval. They thought they had reached the edges of Asia, but in reality it was an entire continent that had just entered European history. Behind Columbus's feet lay a limitless horizon, vast lands, fabulous riches, countless peoples. It was the dawn of a new era, and Spain, through chance and audacity, had become its pioneer. The songs of victory from Granada still echoed in the churches, but now another melody rose, carried by the breath of the ocean. It was a promise, a mystery, a vertigo, that of the New World. Spain had just crossed the threshold of a planetary adventure. It had opened a door that nothing would ever close again. Chapter 2. The Conquistadors and the Fury of the New Worlds. Part 1. Cortés and the Aztec Empire. When news of Columbus's discoveries spread across Spain, they took the form of an intoxicating promise. Tales of fertile lands, countless peoples, and fabulous riches abounded. In the taverns of Seville, in the ports of Andalusia, every sailor dreamed of glory and gold. But among this multitude one man would rise above the others, Hernán Cortés. Born in 1485 in Medellín, Extremadura, Cortés was not from a high lineage. His family belonged to the proud but poor provincial nobility, without real power. From childhood, he was driven by a devouring ambition. He studied law at Salamanca, but his restless temperament soon pushed him toward another destiny, that of arms and adventure. When he heard of the New World, he understood that his chance lay there, the stage where he could write his own legend. At the age of 19, he embarked for Hispaniola. There, he lived as a colonist, participating in early expeditions, learning about the tropics, men, and wars. His intelligence and bravery quickly distinguished him. But Cortés was not just a soldier. He was a strategist, capable of reading men as well as maps, charming his allies while crushing his enemies. In 1518, as rumors of a vast empire in the heart of Mexico spread, Diego Velázquez, governor of Cuba, tasked Cortés with leading an expedition. But from the outset, mistrust arose between the two men. Velázquez feared Cortés's excessive ambition. At the last moment, he tried to revoke his command. Too late. Cortés had already set out, defying orders but carrying the implicit blessing of his soldiers. The adventure could begin. In early 1519, Cortés left Cuba with about 500 men, a few horses, and a handful of cannons. The expedition seemed paltry against the unknown vastness awaiting them, but faith in their leader galvanized his companions. Cortés knew that audacity was the key, better to charge forward than retreat. Upon arriving on the Yucatan coast, the conquistador demonstrated his cunning. He allied with indigenous peoples oppressed by the Aztecs. The Totonacs, weary of imperial yoke, saw in him an unexpected ally. Cortés presented himself not as an invader, but as a liberator, promising to free them from Tenochtitlan's bloody domination. At every step, he exploited divisions among the peoples to strengthen his own force. One episode particularly marked this alliance, the meeting with Malintzin, later known as Doña Marina, an enslaved woman given to Cortés. She proved to be an exceptional linguist, speaking Maya and Nahuatl, the Aztec language. Through her, Cortés could now communicate, negotiate, and manipulate. She became his interpreter, advisor, and sometimes his shadow. History would judge her as both a traitor and a mediator, but without her, the conquest would likely have failed. Cortés also understood that to galvanize his men, he had to cut off all hope of retreat. At Veracruz, on the coast, he deliberately scuttled his ships. This radical act meant one thing: there was no turning back. The soldiers understood that their fate would be decided here, in the jungles and mountains of Mexico, with only one outcome: victory or death. The march to Tenochtitlan was an epic journey. Cortés and his men crossed jungles, valleys, lakes, and volcanoes. Everywhere, they impressed local populations with their horses, creatures unknown to the natives, with their steel weapons and thunderous cannons. To these peoples, these men from the sea seemed almost supernatural. Cortés played this aura masterfully, hinting that he was the envoy of a distant god. In November 1519, after months of marching, he finally reached Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. The city rose like a mirage in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Vast causeways connected it to the shores, white pyramid temples stretched toward the sky, and markets teemed with thousands of souls. To the Spaniards, it was a vision of unparalleled splendor, comparable to Constantinople or Rome. The Emperor Montezuma III welcomed Cortés with solemn hospitality. In his mind, he saw in this bearded leader perhaps the incarnation of an ancient god returned from across the sea. Gifts of gold and feathers were offered, banquets were held, but Cortés had not come to admire. He had come to dominate. Quickly, he took Montezuma hostage in his own palace, turning the imperial court into a gilded prison. It was a daring, almost reckless move, but it revealed his full determination. The conquest, however, could not be reduced to this bold stroke. Tensions mounted. The Aztecs, humiliated, revolted. Bloody battles broke out in the capital streets. The episode of the Noche Triste in June 1520 marked a turning point. The Spaniards, attacked from all sides, were forced to flee Tenochtitlan under rain and war cries. Many perished in the canals, weighed down by the gold treasures they tried to carry. Cortés himself narrowly escaped death, but the man was not one to give up. Rebuilding his forces, he forged new alliances with peoples hostile to the Aztecs, notably the Tlaxcaltecs. In 1521, he launched the final assault on Tenochtitlan. It was a relentless siege where hunger, thirst, and disease claimed more lives than swords. Spanish cannons roared, and indigenous alliances brought tens of thousands of additional warriors. Finally, the great city fell, its temples burned, its palaces reduced to ruins. Thus ended the Aztec Empire, one of the most brilliant civilizations of the continent, swept away in a few years by a handful of men and the strategic genius of a conquistador. Cortés, now master of Mexico, sent Charles V cargoes of gold and tales of victory. Spain had just laid the foundations of an immense colony, New Spain, which would become one of the jewels of its empire. But behind the glory and triumphant songs, a shadow was already spreading. The conquest was also a tragedy. Millions of indigenous people perished, not only by weapons, but above all by diseases brought from Europe, unknown until then. Smallpox, in particular, decimated the population, breaking entire peoples. This demographic shock would forever alter the continent's balance. For Spain, however, the conquest of Mexico was the signal of an irresistible power. If a handful of men could topple such a vast empire, then anything seemed possible. The dream of glory and gold now extended southward toward other kingdoms. The era of the conquistadors was just beginning. Part 2. Pizarro and the Fall of the Inca Empire. After the lightning conquest of Mexico by Hernán Cortés, a conviction spread among the Spaniards. Across the seas, the gods seemed to offer a handful of men the chance to topple millennial empires. If the Aztecs had fallen, why wouldn't other kingdoms follow? This fever of conquest, fueled by glory and gold, soon led to the Andes, where one of the world's vastest empires stood, the Inca Empire. In the heart of the 16th century, the Inca Empire dominated South America, from Quito to Santiago, from the Pacific coast to the icy peaks of the Andes. Paved roads stretched for thousands of kilometers. Storehouses overflowed with provisions, and splendid cities like Cusco and Quito testified to the power of this civilization. Millions of subjects obeyed their emperor, the Sapa Inca, considered the son of the sun. This empire seemed invincible, but it would collapse in a few years under the blows of a man even more audacious than Cortés, Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro came from the same poor land as Cortés, Extremadura. An illegitimate son, a shepherd in his childhood, he could neither read nor write, but he had the toughness of men forged by hardship and the relentless ambition of those whom nothing stops. Having set out for the New World, he rose through the ranks by his courage and endurance. In Panama, he heard tales of a fabulous land to the south, where gold abounded in unimaginable quantities. These rumors, like embers on his thirst for glory, ignited a fire in his heart that would never be extinguished. In 1524, Pizarro attempted a first expedition southward with Diego de Almagro. It was a disaster. Impenetrable forests, diseases, and storms decimated them. But Pizarro did not give up. In 1526, he launched a second attempt. This time, he reached the shores of present-day Peru. The indigenous villages he encountered, the gold objects he glimpsed, were enough to confirm his dreams. There indeed lay an empire of unparalleled wealth. Back in Panama, he faced skepticism, but his determination was such that he traveled to Spain, to the court of Charles V. The emperor, fascinated by Cortés's accounts and eager for new riches, granted him in 1529 the capitulation of Toledo. Pizarro was officially authorized to conquer Peru in the name of the Spanish crown. With this document, he became the master of his own destiny. In 1531, Pizarro returned with a small band, about 180 men, a few horses, a handful of cannons and arquebuses, a paltry number against an empire of millions. But like Cortés, he knew that technical superiority, audacity, and cunning could compensate for numerical inferiority. And fate would have it that the Inca Empire was then on the brink of chaos. A civil war was ravaging the Andes. Two brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa, were vying for the throne. Ultimately, Atahualpa triumphed and marched toward Cusco, to consolidate his power. It was at this precise moment that Pizarro appeared. The conquistador exploited this fracture. He presented himself as a messenger from beyond the seas, bearer of the cross and the sword. The decisive encounter took place in Cajamarca in November 1532. Atahualpa, confident in his power, arrived with a retinue of several thousand soldiers. Pizarro had only 100 armed men. The contrast was overwhelming, but the conquistador had prepared a trap. When the emperor arrived, a Spanish priest stepped forward, holding a Bible. He called on Atahualpa to recognize the Christian faith and the authority of the King of Spain. The Inca, proud and incredulous, threw the book to the ground. That gesture was the signal. Then Spanish cannons roared, arquebuses spat death, and horses, creatures unknown to the Incas, charged into the panicked crowd. It was a massacre. Atahualpa's soldiers, surprised and disorganized, could not resist. Pizarro and his men carved a path to the emperor and captured him. In a matter of moments, the man who ruled over millions was reduced to a prisoner, chained in a dark room. Atahualpa, to save his life, offered Pizarro an unimaginable ransom, a room filled with gold up to the height of a man, and 2 others filled with silver. The Spaniards accepted. Thousands of sacred objects, statues, and jewels were torn from temples and melted into ingots. Never had Europe seen such a treasure, but once the ransom was paid, Pizarro did not keep his promise. Atahualpa was summarily judged and executed, strangled in his cell in August 1533. With his death, the Inca Empire lost its soul. Pizarro then marched on Cusco, the sacred capital. The city fell almost without resistance, betrayed by internal divisions and paralyzed by the loss of its sovereign. Once again, the Spaniards were struck with admiration at the grandeur of the architecture, the golden temples, the perfectly fitted stone palaces. But soon, the conquest turned to plunder. Mountains of gold and silver were melted down and shipped to Seville. In a few years, one of the world's most powerful empires had been destroyed by fewer than 200 men. The world was stunned. Spain, already crowned with victory in Mexico, became the heir to a second fabulous empire. Galleons laden with precious metals began to flood into Europe, transforming Seville into an unrivaled commercial hub. For the Incas, however, it was a nameless tragedy. Temples were destroyed, traditions shattered, and European diseases wrought havoc, far worse than swords. The Andean world, rich in its gods and customs, sank into a darkness from which it would never fully recover. As for Pizarro, he tasted glory and power. He founded Lima in 1535, making it the capital of New Castile. But as often with conquistadors, ambition and jealousy led to discord. His companions, frustrated, turned against him. In 1541, Francisco Pizarro was assassinated in his own home in Lima, stabbed by rivals. Thus perished the man who had toppled the empire of the sun. But his death did not erase his work. Peru remained the centerpiece of the Spanish Empire in South America. The Potosí mines, discovered soon after, became the beating heart of Spanish wealth. Mountains of silver flowed to Europe, fueling the glory and power of the Habsburgs. The fall of the Inca Empire was not merely a military victory, it was one of the greatest upheavals in history. In a few decades, two millennial civilizations, Aztec and Inca, vanished, replaced by a new order imposed by a handful of conquistadors. And behind them, it was Spain itself that advanced, drunk with power, carried by the momentum of conquest. Part 3. Expansion to the Philippines and the Pacific. The conquest of Mexico by Cortés and the fall of the Inca Empire by Pizarro had already made Spain the dominant power in the New World. But for the sovereigns and adventurers, this was only a beginning. Beyond the newly discovered continents lay an even vaster horizon, the Pacific Ocean, the Southern Sea, an infinite expanse promising other lands, other riches, and perhaps the long-desired routes to Asia. This dream took shape as early as 1519, when Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese in the service of Spain, set sail from Seville with 5 ships. His goal was audacious: to reach the Spice Islands, the famous Moluccas, by sailing west. Where Columbus believed he would find Japan and India, Magellan sought to prove that the earth could be circumnavigated, that Spain could reach Asia without challenging Portugal by rounding Africa. Magellan's voyage was an odyssey, worthy of ancient tales. After crossing the Atlantic, he sailed along the coasts of South America in search of a passage. Storms, hunger, and mutinies nearly destroyed him. But in October 1520, his expedition found the narrow strait that now bears his name, the Strait of Magellan. By crossing this icy corridor between cliffs and raging winds, the Spaniards reached an unknown sea, surprisingly calm. Magellan named it the Pacific. This calm, however, was deceptive. The crossing lasted 3 months without food or fresh water. The sailors, reduced to gnawing boiled leather, died of hunger and scurvy. Yet in March 1521, they reached a verdant archipelago, the Philippines. There, for the first time, the Spanish flag was planted in Asia. But Magellan's fate ended abruptly. On the island of Mactan, he sought to impose his authority on a local chief, Lapu-Lapu. In a fierce battle, Magellan was killed by a spear. His companions, despairing, took to the sea without him. Of 5 ships, only 3 remained, then 2. Finally, only one, the Victoria, managed to return to Spain in 1522 under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano. On board were 18 emaciated survivors, but they carried a glory beyond measure. They had completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. This voyage proved 2 fundamental things. The earth was indeed round, and Spain now had the ability to connect Europe to Asia via the west. Though Magellan perished, his name became legendary. His expedition, despite the losses, opened the doors of the vast Pacific to Spain. In the decades that followed, other expeditions solidified this presence. The Philippines became a major objective. In 1565, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi succeeded in establishing a lasting colony in Cebu, then in Manila in 1571. Manila became the pearl of the Spanish Orient, a port where Chinese, Japanese, Malay, and European merchants crossed paths. From there began one of the most famous commercial circuits in history, the Manila Galleon. Each year, these massive ships crossed the Pacific, connecting Manila to Acapulco in Mexico. They carried silks, porcelains, spices, and treasures from Asia, traded for silver, extracted from the mines of Peru and Mexico. Thus was created a trans-Pacific route, linking east and west under Spain's aegis. Never before had an empire managed to unite 3 continents in such a vast chain. Through this expansion, Spain transformed into a truly global power. Its possessions stretched from Seville to Lima, from Mexico to Manila, from Naples to Milan. The proverb was born: in the Spanish Empire, the sun never sets. For from Europe to America, from America to Asia, there was always a Spanish territory lit by the sun. For the peoples encountered, however, this expansion meant upheaval and domination. In the Philippines, forced conversion to Christianity went hand in hand with the establishment of a rigid colonial power. Churches rose on the ruins of temples, and local chiefs had to bow to the authority of Spanish governors. But Spanish influence, mingling with Asian cultures, also created a hybrid society at the crossroads of worlds. In European courts, news of these successes resounded like a fanfare. Charles V, then Philip II, could present themselves not only as masters of the old continent, but as sovereigns of a universal empire. The papacy itself blessed this expansion, seeing in the conquest of Asia a sacred mission of evangelization. Yet, this grandeur rested on incommensurable sacrifices. Thousands of sailors perished in the crossings, millions of indigenous people suffered under colonial rule, and the riches came at the cost of blood. But at the time, Spain saw only the confirmation of its divine election. It saw itself as the armed arm of God, tasked with bringing the cross and the crown to the ends of the earth. Thus, from Mexico to Peru, from the Andes to the Pacific, the empire of the conquistadors stretched ever further. In a single generation, Spain had conquered 2 continents and reached Asia. It now dominated the Atlantic and Pacific routes, linking the oceans in an imperial embrace. History had never known such a rapid, brutal, and total expansion. The New World had given Spain gold and silver. The Pacific opened the routes to silk and spices. Everything seemed possible. Everything seemed promised to this nation which, in less than a century, had built the first truly global empire. And yet, behind this dazzling grandeur, tensions were beginning to emerge. For governing such a vast world, maintaining such a network of conquests would require infinite resources. But for now, in the late 16th century, Spain shone with unparalleled brilliance. Its ships plied all the oceans, its flags flew over 3 continents, and its kings could believe that nothing would resist their will. Chapter 3. The Apogee, the Empire where the sun never set. Part 1. Charles V, the Universal Emperor. When Charles of Habsburg ascended the throne of Spain in 1516 under the name Charles VI, few could imagine the magnitude of what was to come. Heir to the Habsburg dynasty through his father, Philip the Handsome, and grandson of the Catholic monarchs through his mother, Joanna of Castile, Charles inherited a mosaic of kingdoms that already spanned a vast part of the world. But soon, fate would offer him even more, the dignity of Holy Roman Emperor. Thus, in a few years, this young prince became the master of a collection of territory so vast that his contemporaries said, in his empire, the sun never sets. His inheritance was titanic. From his paternal grandfather, Maximilian I, he inherited Austria and the Habsburg possessions in Central Europe. From his paternal grandmother, Mary of Burgundy, he received the wealthy Burgundian Netherlands. From his maternal grandparents, Isabella and Ferdinand, he obtained the unified kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, with their possessions in Italy, North Africa, and above all, the New World, already yielding its fabulous riches. When, in 1519, he was elected Holy Roman Emperor, adding Germany and symbolic authority over all Christendom to his crown, Charles became the most powerful man of his time, perhaps of all time. His empire was not only vast, it was sprawling. From the Flemish plains to the Austrian forests, from the Italian hills to the Castilian deserts, from the Andes to Mexico, to the distant islands of Asia, all fell under his authority. Spain, already powerful under the Catholic monarchs, became under Charles V the beating heart of a universal empire. But with this grandeur came a burden. Charles was not a king of festivities or palaces, he was a man of war and duty. His entire life was dedicated to defending, maintaining, and expanding his inheritance. He was constantly traveling, crisscrossing Europe on horseback or by carriage, never settled, always on campaign. His enemies were numerous. Francis I's France, Suleiman the Magnificent's Ottomans, the Protestant princes of Germany, not to mention threats from the seas. But everywhere, Charles stood firm, driven by an almost mystical conviction. He believed himself to be the instrument chosen by God to defend Christendom and maintain the unity of the world. In Spain, his arrival was not without conflict. The Cortés of Castile and Aragon viewed this young sovereign, born in Flanders and barely speaking Spanish, with suspicion. The Comuneros revolts of 1520 nearly broke his authority. But Charles quelled these uprisings and gradually won the support of his subjects. He learned the language, adopted the customs, and made Spain not just a possession, but the pillar of his empire. On the military front, Charles achieved dazzling victories. Against Francis III of France, he triumphed at Pavia in 1525, where the French king himself was taken prisoner, an unprecedented humiliation. Against the Ottomans, he organized campaigns in the Mediterranean to contain Turkish expansion. Against the German princes embracing the Reformation, he waged a relentless struggle to preserve religious unity. But beyond the battles of Europe, it was in the New World that Charles's empire took on an unparalleled dimension. Under his reign, the conquests of Cortés and Pizarro consolidated vast territories. Gold and silver arrived in entire cargoes in Seville, transforming the city into a crossroads of wealth and cultures. Entire mountains like Potosí in Peru were gutted to fill the imperial coffers. This flood of precious metals allowed Charles to finance his wars, but also made Spain the target of all ambitions. Charles V's dream was immense. He wanted to restore Christian unity, to build a universal empire unified by faith and crown. But this dream, however grandiose, clashed with realities. Religious divisions, particularly with the rise of Luther and the Protestant Reformation, shook Europe. The wars were incessant, draining resources and exhausting men. The shadow of doubt began to creep into the dazzling light of his glory. Yet, despite these struggles, Charles remained in the imagination of his time as an almost superhuman figure. His contemporaries saw him as a new Alexander, a new Charlemagne. His emblem, the double-headed eagle, dominated the banners of his armies, and wherever he went, his prestige inspired both admiration and fear. But perhaps what makes Charles V unique is his humanity amidst this grandeur. Wearied by wars, worn out by intrigues, he eventually understood that his dream of total unity was impossible. In 1556, he made an extraordinary decision. He abdicated. He retired to the monastery of Yuste in Extremadura to spend his final days in prayer and meditation. This act, rare for a sovereign of his stature, showed that behind the universal emperor was a tired man, haunted by his failures as much as his victories. His empire he divided between his brother Ferdinand, who received the Habsburg lands in Austria and the imperial dignity, and his son Philip, who inherited Spain, its Italian and Flemish possessions, and above all, its American territories. Thus began the reign of Philip II, who would carry Spain to the height of its power. Charles V, in collective memory, remains the symbol of an era when Spain, at the heart of a global network, dreamed of uniting Europe and the world under a single faith and crown. He was the universal emperor whose shadow stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube, from Mexico to the Philippines. His life, made of triumphs and renunciations, embodies the grandeur and fragility of the imperial ideal. Part 2. Philip II, Madrid, Lepanto, and the Escorial. When Charles V, worn out by decades of struggles, abdicated in 1556, he passed to his son Philip a colossal inheritance. This young prince, serious and pious, became Philip II of Spain. With him, the empire changed its face, less nomadic than his father, more austere, but just as determined. Philip would embody the apogee of Spanish power. His reign, lasting over 40 years, marked history as one of the moments when Spain seemed truly to rule the world. Philip the Scatter was not a king of battles, roaming Europe like his father. He was a king of the desk, a king of paper and ink, governing through decrees, correspondence, and reports. But this apparent coldness hid an inflexible will. He saw himself as the champion of the Catholic faith, the armed arm of God on earth, tasked with defending orthodoxy against Protestant heresies and carrying Spanish power to the four corners of the globe. From the start of his reign, Philip made a symbolic decision. He established Madrid as the permanent capital of his empire. Until then, the crown had moved between several cities, but Philip fixed the center of power definitively in the heart of Castile. Madrid, still a modest town, became in a few decades a global capital where diplomats, merchants, courtiers, and administrators from all over Europe and the Americas converged. To embody his vision of centralized power, Philip had one of the most iconic monuments of his time built, the Escorial. Constructed from 1563, this massive palace monastery, erected at the foot of the Sierra de Guadarrama, symbolized the alliance of throne and altar. Sober, massive, almost austere, the Escorial embodied the rigor and piety of the king. But behind this monastic appearance lay a political machine. It was the beating heart of an empire, a place where decisions affecting all of Europe, Africa, America, and Asia were made. On the military front, Philip II's reign was marked by grandiose episodes. The most brilliant was undoubtedly the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. Facing Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean, Philip led the Holy League, a coalition of Catholic powers, and sent his fleet to confront Suleiman's armada. Off the coast of Greece, Spanish, Venetian, and Papal galleys met the Turkish fleet in a titanic battle. Lepanto was a clash of civilizations, a confrontation where the fate of the Mediterranean seemed at stake. Cannons roared, arrows darkened the sky, galleys collided in a tumult of cries and flames. Amid the carnage, a young Spanish soldier, Miguel de Cervantes, fought bravely, losing the use of his left hand. When the dust settled, the Ottoman fleet was annihilated. Lepanto was celebrated as a dazzling victory for Christendom, an immense glory for Philip, now seen as the supreme defender of the faith. But Philip did not confine himself to the Mediterranean. His empire spanned the oceans, and he sought to strengthen it. Under his reign, the American colonies prospered. Silver from Potosí and gold from Mexico flowed into Spain in entire cargoes. The transatlantic and trans-Pacific routes, protected by armed galleons, linked Seville to Veracruz, Acapulco to Manila. Never had global trade known such scope. Philip Dracma saw himself as a providential monarch chosen to carry the faith and power of Spain to the ends of the world. His contemporaries, awestruck, said his empire was a universe in itself. Millions of subjects, languages, peoples, armies, and administrations depended on his pen. Each day, stacks of documents piled up on his palace desk, and the king, tireless, annotated them in a fine, tight script. He embodied the idea of an absolute sovereign, controlling everything, down to the smallest detail. But this grandeur also had its shadows. Governing such a vast empire required colossal resources. The incessant wars against France, the Protestants in the Netherlands, and the English drained fortunes. The gold and silver from the New World, far from bringing lasting prosperity, fueled rampant inflation. The Castilian countryside, squeezed by taxes, emptied. Spanish power rested on fragile foundations, but at the time, no one wanted to see it, for in the collective imagination, Philip II was the very incarnation of imperial majesty. His portraits, painted by Titian and Sanchez Coelho, show him grave, impassive, dressed in black, his hand resting on a sword or a book. His gaze seems to pierce the soul of the beholder. It was the image of a king who bore on his shoulders not only a crown, but the weight of the world. Under Philip II, Spain reached its zenith. Madrid became the capital of a planetary empire. The Escorial, austere and monumental, cast its shadow as a symbol of sacred power. Lepanto, a dazzling victory, made Christendom's enemies tremble, and the galleons, laden with gold and silver, made Seville the beating heart of the global economy. It was Spain's golden age, an era when the entire world seemed to bow before the power of the crown. But already, in the wings, threats were mounting. The wars in the Netherlands dragged on. England challenged naval supremacy, and the economy, despite its riches, was beginning to falter. Yet for contemporaries, none of this yet tarnished the triumphant image of Philip II. He was the king of the world, the monarch whose empire embraced the oceans. Part 3. The gold and silver of the New World, riches and power. Under Philip II, Spain reached an unparalleled brilliance. Beyond military victories and monumental palaces, it was above all the uninterrupted flow of riches from the New World that nourished imperial grandeur. In the ports of Seville and Cadiz, each year, bells rang out at the arrival of galleons laden with gold and silver. These cargoes, coming from the other side of the ocean, symbolized Spain's immense power, transforming it into the beating heart of the first global economic system. The mines of America were the foundation of this prosperity. In Peru, the discovery of the Cerro Rico de Potosí changed everything. This mountain, literally brimming with silver, was exploited relentlessly from 1545. Thousands of indigenous people, subjected to the mita, descended daily into the dark bowels of the mountain. They worked in terrible conditions, breathing dust and handling mercury that slowly poisoned them. Many died, but the flow of precious metals never stopped. Contemporaries said that with all the silver from Potosí, one could have built a bridge from America to Spain. In Mexico, the mines of Zacatecas and Guanajuato complemented this ceaseless flow. Gold and silver were melted into ingots stamped with the royal seal, then transported by mule to the ports of Veracruz or Acapulco. There, they were loaded onto massive galleons protected by powerful escorts. Each ingot crossing the Atlantic became a piece of armor, a cannon, a soldier's pay for the fearsome tercios fighting for the king's glory. Thus, the blood of Andean miners transformed into military power, and the suffering of indigenous people fueled the glory of Europe's battlefields. At the center of this network, Seville shone as never before. The once provincial city became, in a few decades, the economic crossroads of the world. By royal decree, all trade with the Indies had to pass through its port. In its bustling streets flocked Flemish merchants, Genoese bankers, German adventurers, English spies. The Casa de Contratación, a vast bureaucratic institution, controlled every ship, every cargo, every transaction. Behind its walls, scribes meticulously recorded the incessant flow of riches. Spain seemed to rule not only by the sword, but by the gold that coursed through its veins like imperial blood. But this colossal wealth was not without danger. Upon arrival, the ingots went to fill the coffers of foreign bankers. Antwerp, Genoa, and Augsburg became indispensable partners. Spain, rich in precious metals but poor in industry, traded its silver for weapons, fabrics, and goods it did not produce. The flood of silver allowed Philip II to finance his endless wars, but it also caused uncontrollable inflation. In Castile, prices doubled, then tripled, impoverishing peasants and ruining artisans. Spain seemed to swim in abundance, but this abundance sometimes resembled an illusion. To protect this treasure, the Spanish crown established an impressive naval system, the galleon convoys. Twice a year, massive fleets set sail from the Caribbean, escorted by warships. Their majestic silhouettes cut through the Atlantic, linking Havana or Veracruz to Andalusian ports. Each voyage was a titanic undertaking. The galleons carried tons of ingots, but also cocoa, tobacco, sugar, pearls, and precious stones. These ships became the ideal prey for English or French corsairs like Francis Drake, who dared to attack the royal convoys. But despite these ambushes and a few spectacular losses, the system remained robust. guaranteeing Spain near exclusive control over the riches of the New World. And even further across the Pacific, another circuit made the empire's heartbeat. From Manila, founded in 1571, the famous galleon set sail each year, connecting Asia to America. Laden with silks, spices, and porcelains, it crossed the vastest ocean on earth for months to reach Acapulco. There, the goods were unloaded, transported by mule across Mexico, and then reloaded for Spain. This trans-Pacific trade made the Spanish Empire a web enveloping the entire planet. Asia, America, and Europe were now linked in a single network. For the Spaniards of the time, all this seemed the dazzling confirmation of their divine election. No other nation could boast such riches. No other dynasty could claim such supremacy. Contemporaries saw in Philip II not only a king, but the universal monarch, master of the known world. Royal portraits showed a grave sovereign dressed in black, holding in his hands the cross and the globe, two symbols that seemed rightfully his. Yet, beneath the brilliance of this glory, cracks were already appearing. The gold and silver in abundance corrupted the economy more than they strengthened it. Spain grew accustomed to importing everything it needed instead of developing its own industries. Its countryside, squeezed by taxes, grew poorer. Its armies, ever more numerous, devoured fortunes. Behind the facade of absolute power, a troubling dependence was emerging. Without the silver of the New World, the imperial edifice risked faltering. But in the 16th century, no one yet dared to predict such a collapse. In the eyes of contemporaries, Spain was living a golden age. The bells of Seville rang at the arrival of the galleons. The markets buzzed with silks from China, and the churches were adorned with precious objects. The flow of metals, born in the bowels of the Andes and crossing the Atlantic, seemed inexhaustible. In this flow was reflected the grandeur of an empire that dominated the seas and whose sun never set. Chapter 4. The Shadows over the Empire. Part 1. The Black Legend and Local Resistances. As the Spanish Empire expanded to the dimensions of the world, another story was being written. In parallel, darker, more troubling. If, for the Spaniards, the expansion was the work of God and the sign of their divine election, for many enemies and observers, it became the symbol of cruelty, greed, and tyranny. Thus was born what would later be called the Black Legend, a collection of narratives, pamphlets, and testimonies that painted Spain as a bloodthirsty nation, drunk with power and destructive of the peoples it encountered. This discourse, partly based on truths, partly fueled by the propaganda of rivals, took root as early as the first decades of the conquest. Chroniclers reported the massacres committed by the conquistadors, the tortures inflicted on the indigenous peoples, the plundering of temples and villages. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican outraged by the atrocities, published resounding denunciations. In his short account of the destruction of the Indies, 1552, he described with terrible words the suffering of the Amerindian peoples. Villages set ablaze, population slaughtered, children torn from their parents, slavery imposed in the name of the cross and the crown. His accounts, translated and circulated in Europe, became a formidable weapon in the hands of Spain's enemies. The Dutch, the English, the French seized these accusations and amplified them. For them, portraying Spain as a bloodthirsty monster served to justify their own colonial ambitions. Engravings circulated showing Spaniards tearing out the hearts of Indians, burning entire villages, throwing children to dogs. These images, largely exaggerated, shaped the European imagination. Spain became, in the eyes of many, the cruel nation par excellence, the scourge of God, a power both feared and hated. But beyond the propaganda, it is true that the conquest was also a tragedy for the subjugated peoples. In the Andes, in Mexico, in the Caribbean, populations were decimated not only by violence, but by European diseases hitherto unknown. Smallpox, measles, and influenza killed more than weapons. Entire civilizations collapsed in a few decades. The Spaniards imposed their language, their religion, their laws, reducing local social and religious structures to dust. And yet, resistance never truly ceased. Everywhere, uprisings broke out. In Peru, Manco Inca attempted to restore the Inca Empire and led a guerrilla war from the mountains, harassing the Spaniards for years. In Mexico, revolts erupted regularly in remote provinces, requiring punitive expeditions. In the Philippines, villages rose up against missionaries and soldiers. Even in the Caribbean, where the indigenous population had almost vanished, African slaves torn from their continent began to rebel, forging the first black resistances to the colonial system. Faced with these resistances, Spain alternated between repression and integration. It crushed revolts with force, but it also sought to impose a new order. Religious missions entrusted to Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits became instruments of control as much as evangelization. Indigenous peoples were gathered into villages called reductions, where they were to live according to Christian norms. Priests taught the Spanish language, the catechism, and monitored the slightest trace of ancient cults. Despite this pressure, fragments of indigenous cultures survived, often hidden beneath a Christian veneer. In religious festivals, dances and songs retained ancient echoes. In remote mountains, communities continued to worship their gods in secret. Spanish domination had not entirely erased the soul of the peoples. It had forced it to transform, to hide, to survive in other forms. The Black Legend in Europe had a lasting effect. It served as an ideological weapon for those who fought Spain. Rebels in the Netherlands brandished these accounts to justify their struggle. English privateers, such as Francis Drake, presented themselves not as pirates, but as avengers of the oppressed. The image of a cruel, intolerant, and fanatical Spain marked minds for centuries. But paradoxically, this shadow image also reinforced the epic dimension of the empire. For Spain, even criticized, remained at the center of everything. It was spoken of in every court, feared on every sea, admired as much as it was hated for its conquistadors and kings. It became a mythical figure, both a model and a repellent, the incarnation of grandeur and absolutism. For the Spaniards themselves, the criticisms from abroad only strengthened their conviction of being God's chosen, fought because they bore the true faith. In the churches of Castile, preachers described the monarchy as a new Rome, surrounded by jealous enemies, but destined to triumph. Internal propaganda exalted the courage of soldiers, the piety of missionaries, the splendor of the court. The contrast between the external and internal image only added to the dramatic tension of this empire. Thus, in the mid-16th century, Spain shone with gold and silver, but already a shadow was cast over its glory. The Black Legend, the revolts, the criticisms of enemies all foreshadowed that the apogee would not last forever. But for now, Spain still held the world in its hands, and even its darkness contributed to its myth. For an empire of this magnitude could not exist without inspiring as much hatred as fascination. Part 2. The Wars in the Netherlands and Against England. The Spanish Empire, at the height of its glory, did not reign without enemies. At the heart of Europe, in the provinces of the Netherlands, rebellion was brewing. In the north, Elizabeth, or as England, challenged Spain on the seas. These two fronts would become for Philip II open wounds, endless wars that would exhaust the gold of the New World and the strength of his armies. The Netherlands were, for the Spanish monarchy, an invaluable jewel. Inherited from Charles V, they represented a prosperous region rich in trade, artisans, and flourishing cities like Antwerp, Bruges, or Ghent. But this prosperity came with a spirit of independence, nurtured by a long tradition of municipal autonomy. When Philip II, a fervent Catholic, sought to impose his centralized authority and suppress the spreading Reformed ideas, rebellion erupted. In 1566, Protestant iconoclasts, called beggars, destroyed churches, smashed statues, and proclaimed their defiance of Spanish authority. The response was brutal. Philip sent the Duke of Alba to the Netherlands, a ruthless general. He established a Council of Troubles, soon nicknamed the Council of Blood, which sentenced thousands of rebels to death. But the repression, far from extinguishing the fire, fueled it. Under the leadership of William of Orange, the revolt turned into open war. The tercios, that fearsome infantry that made Europe tremble, were deployed. Disciplined, invincible on the battlefield, they won dazzling victories. But each victory turned into a political defeat. The rebel cities took up arms again immediately, supported by the population and Spain's enemy powers. The war in the Netherlands, which began as a local revolt, became an endless conflict that swallowed colossal fortunes. The coffers of Seville, filled with American silver, emptied at the pace of military campaigns, never bringing a definitive solution. At the same time, in the north, another threat was growing. England. Under the reign of Elizabeth, the kingdom had broken away from Rome and embraced the Reformation. For Philip II, the very Catholic king, England had become a hotbed of heresy to be crushed. But beyond religion, the reasons were strategic. English privateers, secretly encouraged by their queen, attacked Spanish galleons laden with gold and silver. Francis Drake, in particular, made a name for himself by plundering Caribbean ports and bringing entire cargoes back to London. For the Spaniards, this was an intolerable insult. Philip II then dreamed of a decisive blow, the invasion of England. His plan was grandiose. A massive fleet, the largest ever assembled, was to cross the Channel escort troops from the Netherlands, and land an army capable of overthrowing Elizabeth. Spain saw itself already mistress of the island, bringing England back into the Catholic fold. In 1588, the Great Armada set sail. 130 ships carrying 20,000 men departed from Lisbon. It was a gigantic armada, a spectacle that inspired both terror and admiration. All of Europe held its breath, but fate decided otherwise. Off the Channel, the Spanish fleet met the resistance of English ships, smaller but more maneuverable. English cannons, firing at long range, harassed the heavy galleons. The English also used fire ships, burning vessels launched against the enemy ranks, sowing panic. Finally, storms, England's allies, scattered the fleet. The Great Armada, meant to be the instrument of Philip II's glory, became his disaster. Less than half the ships returned to Spain, decimated by combat and storms. The defeat was an immense shock, yet Philip II, true to his implacable character, showed nothing. For him, the loss of the Armada was not a spiritual defeat. He declared it was God's will. But for his enemies, it was a triumph. England emerged strengthened, convinced that Providence had protected it. Spain's image of invincibility, however, was cracked. The war in the Netherlands and the rivalry with England became bottomless pits. Each Spanish victory cost so much that it turned into a weakening. The tercios remained invincible in battles, but the gold of the New World was no longer enough to cover expenses. Royal bankruptcies followed one after another. Philip II declared the state bankrupt several times, unable to repay his creditors. Yet, despite these setbacks, Spain remained a feared power. Its armies still dominated southern Europe. Its ships plied the oceans. Its possessions stretched from Manila to Lima, from Naples to Antwerp. But a scent of exhaustion began to hover over this empire. Spain was no longer the irresistible expansion of the conquistadors. It was becoming a besieged fortress, forced to defend its positions everywhere, at an ever heavier cost. In the streets of Madrid, religious processions constantly recalled the kingdom's sacred mission. Sermons proclaimed that the trials were but tests sent by God, that the Catholic monarchy remained his armed arm. But behind this fervor lay a muted anxiety. Spain, despite its treasures, was beginning to tire. Its enemies, meanwhile, seemed each day more numerous, more daring, more determined to challenge its supremacy. Thus, the wars in the Netherlands and the defeat of the Armada were like the first visible cracks in the imperial marble. Spain remained a colossal power, but now it bled constantly to maintain its rank. The world, once conquered with irresistible momentum, became a field of permanent battles, where glory mingled with fatigue. Part 3. Economic and Military Cracks. At the height of its radiance, Spain seemed invincible. Its galleons plied the oceans. Its armies imposed their law in Europe. Its king proclaimed himself the champion of the Catholic faith. Yet, behind this facade of dazzling power, the first cracks were forming. They were not yet visible to all, but they were already gnawing at the imperial edifice. The first poison came from the economy. The gold and silver of the New World, which had made the empire's greatness, proved to be a double-edged sword. Each year, tons of precious metals arrived in Seville, fueling the throne's glory. But this abundance, far from strengthening the Spanish economy, weakened it. The silver was immediately spent to pay for wars, mercenaries, and imports. The Spaniards, accustomed to seeing treasures flow in, neglected the development of their own industries. Castilian artisans, unable to compete with Flemish or Italian products, gradually disappeared. The countryside, crushed by heavy taxes, grew poorer. Far from enriching itself, the people suffered, while the royal coffers emptied at a dizzying pace. Philip II, despite his piety and tireless work, had to declare the state bankrupt several times. The bankers of Genoa and Antwerp, weary of lending to an ever more indebted king, imposed draconian conditions. Each war swallowed fortunes: the Netherlands, Italy, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean. The treasures of Peru and Mexico were not enough to cover these expenses. Thus, paradoxically, the richer Spain became, the poorer it grew. To this economic fragility was added military exhaustion. The Spanish tercios, that elite infantry, remained formidable. Their discipline, their organization into squares of pikes and arquebuses gave them an invincible reputation. But their upkeep cost a fortune. For each victory, new troops had to be raised, their wages funded, their weapons supplied. The endless wars in the Netherlands became a bottomless pit, swallowing the riches of the New World without ever providing a lasting solution. The Spanish population itself began to suffer from this constant tension. The countryside emptied as men were sent to fight abroad. Abandoned fields produced less. Insufficient harvests caused famines, exacerbated by taxes meant to finance the wars. Peasants, bowed under the weight of taxation, saw convoys of gold pass toward Seville without ever feeling the benefit. The empire, vast and glorious, sometimes resembled a colossus with feet of clay. In the cities, poverty mingled with splendor. In Madrid, the court shone with lavish luxury, but the alleys teemed with beggars and vagrants. Grandiose religious processions barely masked the despair of an impoverished population. Writers of the time, lucid witnesses, began to depict this contradiction. The picaresque genre, with works like The Life of Lazarillo de Tormes, portrayed a world where imperial grandeur coexisted with daily misery, where illusions of wealth hid hunger and corruption. Militarily, Spain remained formidable, but its enemies learned to defy it. The English and Dutch perfected their naval art, building faster ships better suited to the Atlantic winds. Privateers multiplied their raids against the galleons. In the Mediterranean, despite the victory at Lepanto, the Ottomans remained a constant threat. Spain found itself having to defend infinite borders, on sea and land, without ever being able to concentrate its forces. This dispersion of efforts undermined imperial efficiency. With each new conflict, finances collapsed, bankers demanded guarantees, and Spain's countryside was squeezed further. The glory, still brilliant, rested on a precarious balance. The most clear-sighted understood that the empire was living beyond its means, burning through its resources faster than it could replenish them. And yet, despite these cracks, Spain retained an unmatched aura. Its kings, surrounded by gold and silks, presented themselves as masters of the world. Its armies still made Europe tremble. Its fleets dominated the oceans. In the imagination of peoples, it remained the invincible empire where the sun never set. But behind the triumphal processions and silvered galleons, reality was slipping away little by little. This contrast gave Spain at the end of the 16th century an almost tragic aura. It resembled an ancient hero, splendid but wounded, glorious but doomed by its own excesses. The economic and military cracks were not yet fractures, but they foreshadowed the time when the empire, despite its prayers and victories, would begin to waver. The Spanish epic, built on blood, gold, and faith, continued, but the shadow of decline was beginning to spread over its banners. Chapter 5, The Twilight and the Legacy. Part 1, The War of Succession and the Loss of Influence. At the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, Spain was no longer the irresistible force it had been under Charles V and Philip II. Military setbacks, economic bankruptcies, and the exhaustion of an overly vast empire had marked the previous century. Yet, Spain remained a giant, feared and respected, even if that giant was beginning to falter. The fatal blow, the one that would shatter the illusion of eternal supremacy, came with the death of Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, in 1700. Charles II, nicknamed the Bewitched, embodied the decadence of a dynasty. Sickly, weak, and sterile, he never produced an heir. His reign was a long agony, marked by court intrigues, famines, and political impotence. Around his deathbed, Europe held its breath. Who would inherit the Spanish Empire? Its territories still covered a vast part of the globe, from South America to the Netherlands, from Naples to the Philippines. The balance of Europe depended on this succession. Two contenders emerged. On one side, the Austrian Habsburgs, close relatives of Charles II, sought to maintain dynastic continuity. On the other, the French Bourbons, backed by Louis XII, saw the opportunity to unite the two greatest Catholic powers under a single dynasty. This prospect terrified all of Europe. A Franco-Spanish kingdom united under one scepter would have been a force capable of crushing all others. The death of Charles II immediately triggered one of the most devastating wars of the era, the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714. For over a decade, Europe was set ablaze. Spain became the battlefield where the future of the continent was decided. The armies of France and Spain faced a coalition formed by England, the United Provinces, the Austrian Empire, and several German states. The fighting was fierce from Italy to Catalonia, from the Netherlands to Castile. Battles like Blenheim, Ramillies, or Malplaquet shook thrones. For the Spaniards, it was a struggle for survival, a war that put at stake not only their dynasty, but the very integrity of their empire. In besieged cities, in ravaged countryside, the people suffered. Famine, crushing taxes, and destruction made the weight of decline tangible. But despite everything, Spain showed unexpected resilience. The Spanish armies, though diminished, defended their soil with tenacity. The elites, divided between supporters of the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, ultimately accepted the choice imposed by history. Philip of Bourbon, grandson of Louis XIV, was recognized as King of Spain under the name Philip V. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, ended the war, but sealed Spain's loss of influence. While the kingdom retained its unity, it had to cede precious possessions. The Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia passed under Austrian domination. Gibraltar and Minorca were conceded to England. The Spanish Empire did not disappear, but it shrank, stripped of territories that had long symbolized its power in Europe. This war was like a cruel mirror held up to Spain. It revealed the exhaustion of an empire that, despite its treasures and glorious history, was no longer able to compete with the rising new powers. England, now mistress of the seas, established itself as the dominant naval force. France, despite its defeats, retained its prestige. Austria consolidated its positions in Central Europe. Spain, meanwhile, retained its colonial empire in America and Asia, but was reduced to a secondary power in Europe. Yet, in this decline, there remained a grandeur. Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain, undertook reforms to modernize his kingdom, inspired by the centralized model of France. Spain attempted to rebuild, to rationalize its administration, to defend its colonies. But the time of universal domination was over. In the eyes of the Spaniards, the War of Succession was a deep wound, but also proof of survival. Despite the losses, despite the humiliation of the treaties, Spain remained standing. Its colonies, still vast and rich, continued to supply Seville and Cadiz with gold and silver. Its ports remained the gateways to a transatlantic trade that still made Europe dream. However, in the songs, processions, and stories, a new melancholy could be felt. The past glories were still exalted, but with the awareness that those glories belonged to a bygone age. The time of the conquistadors, invincible armadas, and dazzling victories seemed already distant. Henceforth, Spain entered an era where it would have to fight not to conquer, but to preserve. Thus, the War of Succession was both a drama and a turning point. It marked the end of the absolute imperial dream, but also allowed Spain to continue its history, to affirm an identity still proud despite the defeats. The Spanish Empire did not collapse that day, but its brilliance was irrevocably tarnished. It was the beginning of a long twilight, where the light still persisted, but the shadow grew inexorably. Part 2. The Independence of the Colonies. For more than 3 centuries, America had been the pillar of the Spanish Empire. From Mexico to Lima, from the Caribbean to the Andes, the colonies had supplied the gold, silver, and goods that had fueled the grandeur of the Habsburgs and then the Bourbons. But in the 19th century, this world built by conquest began to crumble. New ideas, revolutions, local ambitions, and Madrid's mistakes would provoke an irreversible upheaval, the independence of the colonies. Tensions had long been simmering. The Criollos, descendants of Spaniards born in America, formed a local elite that felt despised by the metropolis. High positions were reserved for peninsular Spaniards, while the Criollos, though wealthy and educated, were excluded from power. In the countryside, indigenous peoples and mestizos still suffered exploitation, while African slaves populated the plantations. The empire rested on a rigid hierarchy, with the metropolis imposing its authority without compromise. In the 18th century, the Bourbon reforms, aimed at centralizing and modernizing administration, heightened this resentment. Increased taxes, the trade monopoly imposed by Spain, and heightened fiscal pressure on the colonies fueled growing discontent. Added to this were new ideas from Europe: the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the American War of Independence. All these inspired American elites who began to dream of freedom and autonomy. The trigger came from European events. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne, the monarchy's authority collapsed. In the colonies, elites refused to recognize the usurper king. Local juntas were created proclaiming loyalty to the legitimate Spain, but in reality, asserting their autonomy. Little by little, these juntas became the nuclei of true independence movements. In Venezuela, a young Creole with fiery eyes, Simón Bolívar took the lead in the fight. A flamboyant orator and audacious strategist, he dreamed of a united and free America. In the plains, mountains, and jungles, he led heroic campaigns, confronting royal troops with a motley army of peasants, mestizos, and freed slaves. His resounding victories at Boyacá, 1819, and Carabobo, 1821, paved the way for the independence of Gran Colombia, encompassing present-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. Further south, another hero rose, José de San Martín. A military man trained in Spain, but animated by the ideal of liberty, he led an epic march across the Andes to liberate Chile. In 1818, after the victory at Maipú, he freed Santiago and solidified the country's independence. Then, embarking with his troops, he reached Peru, the cradle of the old Inca kingdom. There, he proclaimed independence in 1821, though the struggle was long and difficult. The campaigns of Bolívar and San Martín converged like two arms of the same epic. Together, they put an end to 3 centuries of Spanish domination in South America. The decisive battles of Junín and Ayacucho in 1824 sounded the death knell for Spanish authority. The Viceroy of Peru, the last great representative of Madrid on the continent, had to capitulate. In Mexico, independence took a different form, fueled by popular uprisings. In 1810, the priest Miguel Hidalgo launched the Grito de Dolores, calling the people to free themselves from Spanish oppression. His revolt was crushed, but the torch was taken up by José María Morelos and then Vicente Guerrero. Finally, in 1821, the Plan of Iguala sealed Mexico's independence, proclaimed by Agustín de Iturbide. It was an earthquake. The vastest territory in North America escaped Spanish control. In the Caribbean, things moved more slowly. Cuba and Puerto Rico remained under Spanish domination, protected by their sugar wealth and the strategic importance of their ports. But even there, the spirit of independence began to stir. These independences were a tragedy for Spain. The galleons, which for 3 centuries had brought gold, silver, cocoa, and sugar, ceased to arrive. The treasures of the New World, which had fueled the glory of the Habsburgs and Bourbons, vanished in a few decades. Spain, already weakened by its European defeats, found itself stripped of the most beautiful part of its empire. But if Spain lost its colonies, the legacy of 3 centuries remained. The Spanish language, spread from Mexico to Buenos Aires, became the cement of a continent. The Catholic religion, imposed by missionaries, continued to permeate cultures. The cities, institutions, and universities founded during the colonial era endured. The empire had collapsed, but it had left an indelible mark. For the Spaniards, the loss of America was experienced as a tragedy, a tearing apart. In the salons of Madrid, people spoke of the catastrophe. Poets and writers mourned the past glories. Religious processions invoked Providence, seeking meaning in this series of defeats. But for the peoples of America, it was a rebirth. The independences, though followed by turmoil and divisions, opened the way to new nations, forged in the fire of revolt. Thus ended the great cycle begun in 1492. Spain, which had discovered, conquered, and dominated a continent, had to watch its overseas jewels fly away. It was a twilight, but a grandiose twilight, marked by heroic struggles and immortal figures. The Spanish Empire lost its American heart, but it gained an eternal place in the memory of peoples. For no one could forget that for 3 centuries, Spain had shaped the destiny of an entire world. Part 3. Cultural, Linguistic, and Symbolic Legacy. When one contemplates the history of the Spanish Empire, from the Reconquista to the loss of the colonies, what strikes is not only the scale of the conquests, nor the accumulated wealth, nor even the brutality of the wars. What endures beyond the centuries is the profound imprint this empire left on the world. For if the territories broke away, if the galleons ceased to cross the oceans, if the armies vanished, the cultural, linguistic, and symbolic legacy of imperial Spain lives on today, vibrant across several continents. The first and most striking of these legacies is the language. Spanish, once spoken only on the Iberian Peninsula, spread across the ocean with the conquistadors, missionaries, and settlers. Today, millions of men and women from Argentina to Mexico, from Colombia to California, speak this language that was Cervantes. It is the most tangible trace of the empire, an invisible but powerful link that unites peoples separated by borders, but connected by a common voice. Over the centuries, Spanish has been enriched with indigenous words, new sounds, but it remains the red thread of a shared heritage. The Catholic religion, too, was an indelible legacy. Carried by Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit missionaries, it took deep root in American and Asian societies. The cathedrals raised in the heart of Mexico City, Lima, or Manila still bear witness to this fervor. Processions, religious festivals, and cults of saints merged with local traditions, giving birth to a mestizo Christianity, both Spanish and indigenous. Thus, the Virgin of Guadalupe, appearing in Mexico, embodies this meeting of European faith and pre-Columbian beliefs. Culturally, Spain sowed cities, institutions, and universities that continue to structure modern nations. The grid layouts of colonial cities, the central squares dominated by the church and the governor's house, the roads linking the interior to the ports. All these have lastingly shaped Latin America. In Lima, Bogota, Quito, Havana, the Baroque facades and colonial palaces still tell the story of an empire that sought to impose its grandeur even in stone. But the Spanish legacy is not only material, it is also literary, artistic, symbolic. Imperial Spain gave the world writers like Cervantes, whose Don Quixote became a universal work, a symbol of the madness of grandeur, but also of perseverance in the face of the impossible. It gave painters like Velázquez, whose royal portraits embody the austere majesty of the monarchy, and later Goya, who powerfully denounced the horrors of war. Through these artists, it was the very soul of the empire that was transmitted, made of glory and suffering, splendor and disillusionment. Spanish influence also left its mark on political institutions. The viceroyalties, audiencias, and municipal cabildos left models of administration that were taken up and adapted by independent nations. Even in rupture, the young American republics inherited the colonial order, the structures of power, the legal codes inspired by Spain. Thus, the shadow of the empire continued to loom even after its collapse. But perhaps the deepest legacy is symbolic. For over 3 centuries, Spain saw itself and was perceived as the first world power, a universal empire that linked Europe, America, Africa, and Asia. This dream of unity, though it collapsed, left a trace in the collective imagination. The Spaniards themselves, long after the loss of their colonies, continued to nurture nostalgia for this golden age. In songs, poems, and religious processions, the image of past glory returned, of the time when Spain dictated its law to the oceans. Yet, this legacy is ambivalent, for with the language and faith, Spain also transmitted the memory of violence and domination. The indigenous peoples of America, decimated, subjugated, forcibly Christianized, retained the painful memory of the conquest. African slaves, torn from their land, marked the colonial economy with their blood. The Spanish Empire was both a grandiose adventure and a human tragedy. It is this duality, this mix of light and shadow, that makes it a complex, debated, but inescapable legacy. Even today, the imprint of the empire is visible everywhere, in the languages and accents of Buenos Aires, Mexico, or Madrid, in the Baroque cathedrals standing on American squares, in the stories of Bolivar and San Martin, who defined themselves in opposition to Spain but could not escape its influence, in the very dreams of globalization, which find a first incarnation in this planetary network woven by the Catholic monarchy. Thus, the Spanish Empire, though extinguished, continues to live. It lives in the language spoken by hundreds of millions of men and women. It lives in religion, in traditions, in art. It lives also in collective memory, sometimes celebrated as a golden age, sometimes denounced as an era of violence. But whether exalted or criticized, it cannot be ignored. The sun has set on the Spanish Empire, but it has not extinguished its light. From Granada to Manila, from Seville to Lima, from Madrid to Mexico, its brilliance persists like an ember that does not die out. For it was the first truly global empire, and from that grandeur, echoes still remain. Empires pass, but some leave an eternal imprint. Spain, through its language, its faith, its art, and its memory, belongs to that category. Its empire collapsed, but its legacy continues to inhabit the world. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through history. I hope this tale has brought you peace and wonder. Don't forget to subscribe to Twilight Tales for more stories to guide you into a serene sleep. Take care and see you soon.